how do you get rid of a population of people that you don't want in your country anymore? And there's an absolutely crucial document. Chancellor Helmut Kohl, who became chancellor in 1982.
Yeah. Dr. Kahn, I want to talk to you about this term, Auslander. Could you pronounce it so that we get the German right here, please?
Auslander.
Auslander. For background purposes, before you tell me what that means, what does it take to become a German citizen?
So historically, German citizenship for, over 100 years was defined only by blood, right? That you had to be German by blood, German parentage in order to become a German citizen. However, the citizenship law started changing in the 1990s, and in 2000, there was a really important revision that allowed for somebody who was not ethnically German but had lived in Germany for a certain amount of years to be able to gain German citizenship. So that was a big change that came in 2000. Um,
So I understand the term Auslander means foreigner, but does it have like a more menacing or pejorative connotation to it?
yeah, 100%. So
Hmm.
um, Auslander has this kind of pejorative connotation or kind of like an insulting and racializing connotation to it because even people who have lived in Germany for 60 years but perhaps have a migration background or aren't ethnically German, they'll be considered or sometimes derogatorily called Auslander or foreigners, even if they've lived there for a long time, even if they have German citizenship, right?
Hmm.
So it just implies somebody is outside the German community, even if you might have citizenship on the basis of being not ethnically German.
So this is we've gone over this several times. Not being ethnically German. So would a Dutch family or a Danish family or a Swedish family that came to Germany 50 years ago, 40 years ago, would they be called Auslander or no? That's reserved for Southern Europeans and Muslims and Middle Eastern and what have you. Do you see the distinction between those two?
Right. So yeah, it has the racializing connotation in terms of, the Europeanness, in terms of the color of your skin, etc. So usually Auslander would not like if I go to Germany, I'm usually not going to be called like an Auslander, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm white. I'd be considered kind of an American who's living in Germany, right? Or someone from the Netherlands, maybe a Dutch person who's living in Germany. But Auslander has this racializing component where it's referring particularly to migrants from the Middle East, from North Africa,
Wow.
right? From places that have historically been considered non-European, also non-Christian,
Yeah.
right?
Um, Okay, so let's talk about them. I want to share some stats from your book, Foreign in Two Homelands. Actually, the full title is Foreign in Two Homelands, Racism, Return Migration, and Turkish German History. So this is what I wanted to share, Dr. Kahn. Every fourth person in Germany is now ethnically non-German. There are 23.8 million migrants in Germany, 3 million of which are Turks. Did I get the data right? Yeah. So, and then I did a little bit of a research, a cursory research myself. Germany's population in 2023 was 84.7 million. So the 23.8 million that are who are ethnically non-German is about 28% of Germany's population now, which is a huge number. By comparison, in 2023, 14.3% of US population was foreign born. I get it. I appreciate that being foreign born and not being ethnically German are different. They're not equivalents. But still, I think the point uh, is clear that Germany has a huge foreign immigrant population. So, given all of this, the huge migrant population, Are you at all surprised that AfD and other far right parties are gaining ground?
I mean, I would say that it's generally, I mean, it's,
I'm not blaming the foreigners or anything like that. I'm just, you know,
yeah, I mean, historically, when we see moments of economic crisis and moments of large immigrant populations coming to the country, that those are the moments where you tend to see a large anti-immigrant backlash,
yeah,
which is something that the AfD, the far right party, has really capitalized on. So in terms of what like generally you'd we would understand about where migration and economics fits together, it makes sense that a party like the AfD would be able to gain power.
yeah, yeah. I mentioned your book, so let's talk about your book, Foreign into Homelands. This is a point that I kept on wondering about, and I do, and you do provide some explanation. And it's this: German authorities made a point of uh, calling Turkish workers, the migrants that they had invited, as guests. Is there is that term significant?
Yeah, it's a very significant term. So, for some context here, like why is there such a high proportion of migrants and particularly Turks?
Please, yeah.
So after World War II, Germany was, economically devastated, bombed out, in shambles. There was a shortage of manpower because so many men had been killed fighting in the war. Um, and West Germany, in particular, needed to revitalize its economy, right? So it got
Mm-hmm.
an injection of funds through the Marshall Plan, right? But the other thing is that who was there to work in the German factories and mines to fuel what's called that economic miracle, where Germany recovered so quickly? Like I said, there's a shortage of manpower. Germans really didn't want women working outside the home, right? It's the 1950s, it's a time of
Oh,
conservatism, right? So all of this led the West German government to implement a program that, as you said, they called the guest worker program. Guest worker is Gastarbeiter in Germany. So the West German government in 1955 starts the guest worker program. They first invite workers from Italy, Spain, Portugal, um, and then they start inviting workers from Turkey, Yugoslavia, Greece, Morocco. And the idea here is that these guest workers would come to West Germany. They would work for just 2 years at a time, at which point they would be rotated out with new workers from those countries. And the idea of guest is important here because they were not supposed to be permanent. They were supposed to just temporarily be there as guests. And
did
West
anyone
Germany,
call them temporary workers? That almost makes more sense, but they decided on guest.
they decided on guest, and
Yeah.
it's important because there was a guest. You have a hospitable connotation. You come to my house, I treat you like a guest, I treat you nicely, right? And so this kind of positive connotation of guest
Oh,
was deliberately created in contrast to the other forms of foreign labor that had existed in Germany during the Nazi period, which was forced labor, right?
I see. I
So the
see.
idea is,
Yeah.
okay, we have just brought forced laborers here against their will. Now we're going to kindly invite guests from other countries, and we're going to treat them nicely, and then they're going to leave.
That makes the word guest really important in this context now. Interesting. Another point that I thought it was really interesting, and this is my own assessment, is assimilation of Turkish guest workers into German culture. I shouldn't say assimilation of Turkish guest workers. There are now families that have lived there for 60, 70 years now, however long it's been. Um, I've always wondered this, even before preparing for my conversation with you. Is this lack of assimilation or insufficient assimilation sort of like a chicken and egg thing? They don't assimilate, but maybe the German government is not letting them assimilate.
Exactly. So, and this goes back to the word guest. So, because the workers were only supposed to stay for a short period of time, the German government, West German government, really never did anything to kind of integrate them into society, right? So, at least for Turkish workers who came, who by the 1960s and 70s were the largest minority.
Hmm.
Uh, there was a sense, we should teach them German when they're on the job because they need to be able to communicate with their managers in factories and mines. But beyond that, there was really no effort to integrate anyone in the first place. So by the late 1970s, when Turkish workers decide most of them that they're going to stay in Germany and bring their families, the West German government really didn't do anything. And so West Germans started to blame Turks for not integrating. And this Turks are a particularly important group, not only because they were the largest ethnic minority and still are, but also because 99% were Muslim,
Yeah.
right? And so this leads to this Muslim Christian cultural clash, as well as the sense that the Turks who were coming were, quote, backwards, right? So the vast
Oh,
majority of Turks who were coming to Germany as guest workers and their families came from the rural parts of Turkey, from Anatolia, not from Istanbul, right? And so there's a
so
sense
not a metropolitan area, more like villages and yeah.
exactly, right? And this is the 1970s. There's like a lot of these villages, they don't have electricity yet, they don't have running water. So there becomes these tropes already by the 70s and especially the 80s about Turks are, in a lot of West Germans' opinion, that they're Muslim, they're uneducated, they're illiterate, they're backwards. Another really important one was the perception that Muslim men were patriarchal and abusive of women. This is kind of embodied in the figure of the woman with the headscarf.
Yeah.
And Germans set these stereotypes about Turks and about Muslims in contrast to the way that West Germans thought about themselves, which was we're liberal, we're democratic, we're modern, free. This is also the rise of the feminist movement in the 1970s, right? That we support women's rights and look how Muslim men are treating Muslim women, right? So all of these kind of binary stereotypes emerged in the 70s and 80s that lead to a big sense that Turks can never assimilate, they can never become German or hold German values, and therefore that they should go home.
Wow. Um, Speaking of going home, there's this line in your book. It goes something like this: foreigner in Germany, Almanci in Turkey. What is that about?
Yeah, so there's this word Almanci, which is like absolutely crucial to the research for my book. It's like the key word of my book. And yes, there's a phrase, foreigner in Germany, Almanci in Turkey. Almanci, as I translate it, is Germanized Turk. The word Almanci is a very derogatory colloquial word in Turkish. Alman is like German, Almania is Germany,
Yeah.
and it sense that people in the home country in Turkey, they look at the migrants who went to Germany and they say that person is no longer fully Turkish. They've Germanized. These are kind of like Turks who are, they're not real Turks anymore, right? This is this sense, this derogatory sense that people in the home country have. So, with the title of my book, Foreign into Homeland, it refers to the fact that when they're in Germany, Germans are treating the migrants as foreigners, but also when they go back to Turkey, they're treated as Germanized and also kind of foreign in Turkey, that they're in this kind of in between state.
So they don't fit in their original home country either. And I'm gathering that a couple of points that I deduced as I was reading your book. Some of them are actually were born in Germany. These are teenagers, 20-year-olds that are coming back to Türkiye. And for them, Türkiye is kind of like going to Thailand. I mean, that's a bit of an exaggeration because they have Turkish, but they literally are foreigners in Türkiye. And the second thing is just to follow up on what you were talking about, Turkish people coming from villages and the scarf and all of that. Even as I was glancing through some of the images in your book, many of the Turkish women were not practicing Muslims, didn't cover, right?
Yeah.
Did
Exactly.
was that a big point or no? That they were just sort of lumped together with all the other Turks.
Yeah. So we have to remember that the Turkish population who came to Germany is not a homogenous population in reality.
Yeah,
There's also,
yeah.
people who are Kurds, who are Alevis, right? There's some people who are Christian who came. There's women who wore headscarves and were from the villages, but there's also women from the cities, right?
But
One of the main women I interviewed had been a teacher in a city before she decided to come to Germany to work, right? So there's all of these different kinds of Turks who are coming to Germany, but at least in the German rhetoric, in the German discourse around them, they homogenize them all together.
yeah. Um, um, as we were talking about Almanci, I wanted to make sure that I asked this question before we end our conversation. At some point in the 1980s, there's an exodus of Turkish guest workers, migrants back to Türkiye. When is this? What happens? What's the background to this?
Yeah, this is also important, crucial to my book. So, as I had mentioned before, by the late 1970s, early 1980s, this is the height of anti-Turkish racism in Germany up till that point. Um, so by the 1980s, many Germans are, ordinary Germans, but also neo-Nazis. They're calling for Turks to get out of the country and go home, right? And this leads, of course, to, important
I'm sorry,
conversations.
is this discourse published like in regular radio stations and TV channels, or is it still on the fringes? You're shaking your head.
Not in the fringes anymore by the 1980s. So of
Oh,
course you have
wow.
like right-wing extremist
Uh,
neo-Nazis like violently attacking Turks and other minorities on the streets in the 80s. Because to go back to the conversation about neo-Nazism had become so strong by the 1970s and 80s, in large part due to that influx of propaganda from the United States, that it was neo Nazis who were more organized, who were going out campaigning against Turks, demonstrating in the streets, spraying graffiti, attacking people. So the 80s is the heyday of neo Nazism up until that point. But
hmm.
it's also the high point of ordinary German anti Muslim racism as well. So if you think of the different
Wow.
sources that I look at, right? It's, writings of neo-Nazis complaining about against Turks, but it's also, mainstream German newspapers, radio, television complaining against Turks. It's internal government memoranda, from the Social Democratic Party, even the center left party, saying we
Wow.
have to do something about, quote, the Turkish problem because there's so much widespread popular unrest against Turks.
They call it the Turkish problem, like on TV and on
Oh
major
yeah,
newspapers. Oh, wow.
often
Okay.
like same thing as like not to draw like a false parallel to the Jewish problem or the right, but it's called, they would use the word the Turkish problem at the time,
But
right?
the Jewish problem goes back to like 1930s, 1940s, and extra. It's not that's why you're saying you don't want to draw a
I don't want to
false
draw
path.
false
Yeah.
comparisons, but what I do highlight in my research and in my book is that a lot of Turkish migrants in Germany in the 80s and a lot of people in the home country were explicitly making parallels to the treatment of Jews in the 1930s. So they were saying,
Wow.
we feel like we're so oppressed in Germany today. We're treated like second class citizens. You're treating us now in the 80s like you treated Jews in the 1930s, right? So it's the
That's
Turks themselves who
wow.
are
That's
not like,
scary.
as a historian, I would never draw these kinds of
Yeah, yeah,
comparisons.
yeah.
But if you look at the rhetoric of the time, Turks were saying, hey, you guys are no better than the Nazis. You're treating us like you treated the Jews.
Wow. What happens then? So we're in the 90s. What happens? Do you have a mass exodus?
So there is. So the West German government, in order to deal with this question of how to get Turks home, the West German government's deciding, essentially this gets to a question of mass deportations, right? Right. How in the West German government's view, it's the year 1983, how do you get rid of a population of people that you don't want in your country anymore? And there's an absolutely crucial document. Chancellor Helmut Kohl, who became chancellor in 1982,
Yeah.
he has a meeting with Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister. And they're talking about how to deal with immigrants in both of their countries because Britain had a large immigrant
Yeah.
population at the time. And Helmut Kohl says, I want to reduce the number of Turks by half, by 50%. How do, you know, I want to get rid of half of the Turks in the country. And Chancellor Kohl was, from the, you know, Christian Democratic Party, centrist party, and he's even saying, I need to get rid of half of the Turks in the country because they can't assimilate.
Wow.
So West German policymakers and Kohl's regime are trying to figure out what to do. You can't just mass deport people who came here legally as guest workers.
Yeah.
You can't just do mass deportations, right? So they devise a law that was a really, really controversial law that I write a lot about in my book in 1983. It's the law for the promotion of the voluntary return of foreigners. And I just call this the remigration law because it's kind of easier to understand that
Yeah.
way. And with this law, the West German government decided that they were going to offer guest workers what they called a remigration premium or remigration assistance of 10,500 Deutschmarks to leave the country with their entire family. So essentially, their solution, instead of doing mass deportations, is to pay people to leave, to financially incentivize them to leave the country.
What year was this?
1983
1983. First of all, 10,500 Deutschmarks. That's not that much.
is really not that much. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a couple months. It's a couple months' wages. It's really not all that much. But it was a pretty, it functioned as a kind of strong financial incentive for a lot of people. So there were a lot of Turks who had wanted to leave for a long time. They just wanted to go back to their home country, but they hadn't really made the decision yet. But this money helped push them over the edge,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
well, now's a good time for me to go back. What also was an important factor was that a lot of companies in the early 1980s wanted to get rid of Turkish workers as well, because there's also economic crisis in the early 1980s. So companies would often add severance packages to that. The company would say, okay, you can take the government's premium of 10,500 Deutschmarks. We're going to give you an extra, 5,000, maybe 10,000 Deutschmarks. You leave our company, and you can go home, right?
I see.
Um,
To reduce staff, to reduce payroll. So did Helmut Kohl achieve his quota of reducing Turkish population of Germany to half?
no, not half of the Turkish population left. However, there's a pretty decent amount that left, 15%. So one five
That's still a
percent.
big chunk.
It's a big chunk of them, and
Yeah.
it amounts to some 250,000 men, women, and children left the country in the year 1984 by itself. And this is what I call the mass exodus. This was by far the largest amount of Turks who came back to their home country in German history, one of the largest mass remigrations in the history of modern Europe. Um, so it was a very sizable amount.
This must have been a little bit disruptive to the country, Turkey themselves. How, where do these people go? Where do they start working, and all of that? That could be conversation for another podcast.